Hello, everybody. Welcome back to our series of sessions on marine data, UN Ocean Decade. This is session 2 of 3 called Presentations and a Panel Discussion of Trustworthy Data Networks like ODIS for Marine Data in the Ocean Decade. This session is being put on by 4 different groups in ESIP: the Marine Data Cluster, Semantic Harmonization Cluster, Semantic Technologies Committee, and schema.org cluster. And so just to a roadmap for what we're discussing in this session, we're going to review session 1 that we hope most of you have been able to attend. Then we'll have some presenters. There will be a topic, a panel topic for all of our presenters to discuss, answer some questions, and then we'll have a little bit of time at the end for a general discussion. And after that, we'll wrap up and give a brief preview of session 3 tomorrow at 1:30 Eastern. And so for our presentations from session 1, we had Adam Shepard talking about science on schema.org, Pierre talking about ODIS, Doug going more into ODIS, talking about the ODIS architecture and data model, and then Karen Stocks talking about Deuce and deepening the ocean, and Kate Rose going into CMEX and making it more fair, and finally Marshall Ma discussing work with semantic technology. And today, this session, we'll have Gary Berg-Cross, who will be our panel moderator and present a few slides on fair trusted data networks, capacity building and care principles for open repositories. Then we'll have Bob Downs talking about trust in the network, applying trust to research data stakeholder roles. Marshall Ma talking about leveraging provenance for the transparency and trustworthiness of open data. Shanhao Li talking about a recommender system for open data with trust ranking and social trust network. And finally, Pierre again with ODIS as a trustworthy data network. And at this point, I'll turn it over to Gary.
Okay. All right, let's see if I can share my screen successfully and make this full screen slideshow. Okay, hopefully you can see everything now. So I'm Gary Berg-Cross. I'm the co-lead of the Semantic Harmonization Cluster, and I'm happy to kick off this session. I have an approach. Given the theme of the January meeting, it seems useful for me to start by setting some context with a short overview about fairness as well as trust ideas. With data and its services, we often talk about these in terms of the 5 socio-technical factors you see in the blue box in the middle of this diagram, and you've heard that before, for going from transparency to technology. More about these later. I also have a 3-part vision diagram in this first slide. On the left is a label for an aspirational goal, which is a digital network knowledge commons. In the middle box, I represent activities going on as part of the Ocean Decade. It's a world of sensors and data collection. And on the right is another ingredient that makes the vision possible, a loosely connected but trustworthy collection of reusable digital resources supported by infrastructure, providing findability, access, interoperability. Trust is involved in all of these boxes and the cooperating elements that make them up. So let's proceed to understand these a little bit better. Slide 2, a busy slide, provides a little bit of the context of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, for societies, things like handling climate change and its effects. In this diagram, we have one Ocean Decade activity supporting the UN's SDGs, understanding what is going on in life below water. And this is reflected in the middle portion of this busy diagram, as well as what you saw on slide 1. Many sustainability goals are related here, such as clean water and sanitation, climate action, waste reduction, and then there are data aspects of trust. And I'll cover a little bit of that in this slide. This makes the point that large network technical efforts, which are now ecosystem-like, rely on trustworthy interactions from relative strangers for things like funding resources, who's responsible and who is it sustainable with this funding, mutual understanding of marine data, how to access and reuse all these. To help with this and the Ocean Decade goals, we have the Ocean Information Hub shown in the diagram here, discussed in our first session, a large eco-like system of complex networks with nodes and agents interacting and collaborating with each other, defining and allowing ways to find, archive, use data, as well as foster innovation and create value. OID's functions support goals to deliver skills, knowledge, and technology for all, and as it says here, to ensure comprehensive capability and capacity development and equitable access to data, information, and knowledge and technology across all aspects of ocean science and for all stakeholders, unquote. A challenge for achieving and trusting all of the work involved towards these goals is that complexity involves ambiguity, and there's always a risk of misunderstanding or misusing information. Users need help. Considerations of data fairness is one help. The semantic harmonization cluster is another approach to trying to make people understand different vocabularies that describe data. The next slide, slide four, leverages some ideas on fairness. Fairness was mentioned in session one by Kate Rose and Marshall. Metadata, especially rich metadata, is highlighted here and plays a role in both trust and fairness. This table illustrates some of the ways that rich metadata, whatever that means, contributes to four dimensions of fairness. One aspect of richness for metadata relies on semantic resources, such as controlled vocabularies, taxonomies, even conceptual models to make data and metadata findable and interoperable. And the semantic harmonization cluster in particular has been focusing on those aspects of metadata and semantic harmonization. I would call your attention to the bottom row of the reusability factor of FAIR for another source of richness, which are community standards. We heard a little bit about that in session one on SOSO, for example. A simple point here is that rich things like controlled vocabularies and organizing taxonomies need to be developed using best practices by domain communities. There are, for example, FAIR implementation communities doing such work. And again, the semantic harmonization cluster has worked on some approaches to support that. Slide 5,
Gary,
a very busy slide,
Gary.
represents a, yes,
Hi, I don't want
represent,
the top of your slides are cut off. I don't know if you want to just keep going, that's okay. I didn't want it. Oh, okay.
Does this
I,
help?
I'm not sure. I saw some chatter in the.
Okay.
I think I think it's
Well, let me know. I'll start on
okay.
this.
I think it's
I don't need to, you don't need to understand everything
yeah.
on here, sort of illustrating something.
I was gonna say
So
I
this
think we
is
can still understand. Yeah, speaks for itself. Thank you.
this is a small part of an effort to develop a matrix of fairness, quality, maturity measures. It's structured, tiered, and progressive approach to evaluating and reporting um, on the degree of fair compliance. It uses 41 fair data maturity indicators, which have rigorous specifications that are consistent with the 15 fair data principles. And they're used to generate data, metadata, fairness, as well as infrastructure, which is the three things you see represented on this diagram: data on the left, metadata on the right, and above, infrastructure. In part, this is a checklist-like approach, which breaks down definitions into key categories, which you see here: core concepts, category-specific requirements, and focus elements. And there are mappings between these. So there's too much to discuss in this detail here, but I thought it worth mentioning and having people be aware of this effort. Ji Ping, who was invited to the panel but had a conflict, along with others, has been developing FAIR indicators. And I'm using this slide to make people just aware of the approach. And I have also been somewhat involved in this effort. You will notice that the diagram is color-coded. So data on the left is green and metadata is orange. Infrastructure is in blue. Again, think of what is represented here as the basis of a checklist to fill out and information about the quality and level of data and metadata. As we have seen, rich metadata plays a big role in achieving data goals such as access and retrieval. and it's used for such things as documenting provenance, and it provides context. So a quality indicator approaches using levels of fairness for things like metadata, rich metadata, minimal, intermediate, and optimum levels. Thus, at level 3, vocabularies involved in metadata are not just used, but governed, version controlled, interoperable, and reusable. So breaking fair guiding principles down in this way is useful to help people make sure they are consistently covering the fairness points, and therefore that data can be trusted, as well as systems that employ it. At the same time, it intends to provide a more holistic view of fair compliance because you can see all the relationships. One thing missing is to improve guidance over time is to show, and improve guidance is to show more of the relationships between things so that people understand how one thing supports another. For example, in the bottom right of the diagram, the diagram, we have things like language for knowledge representation that is formal, accessible, and shared. But of course, having a logic representation applies to rich metadata, making it more valuable if we use a knowledge standard. And then, of course, community developed vocabularies are used for metadata. Providing some integrated guidance on such things is what we're looking to do next, and to provide some helpful documentation for data and metadata. The final diagram I will show, I'm trying to show, I guess it's got stuck. Oh, here it is. Hopefully you can see this. This is again the 5 elements that are often used to judge trust in data warehousing and data management efforts. You'll notice that the first 4 of these are non-technical factors, starting with transparency and going through responsibility, user focus, sustainability. So trust is much more than just a technical activity. The social aspects involve things like collective agreements, understanding who's responsible for what, who owns resources, how stable the funding is. All of this, of course, supports the technology at the bottom. The last part of the diagram, which I'll just mention briefly, relates to ODIS and judges ODIS on the basis of all of these things. We have more to say about that in the future. But the idea here is that within a more elaborate ecosystem type of approach, there may be other things to say about trust than the 4 here. And this diagram, or this table, gives some idea about how ODIS covers that. So with that, let me stop sharing and turn the meeting over to our next speaker, Bob, who'll have more to say about trust. And in the interim, I will look at the chat to see if there's anything I need to respond to.
While Bob's getting set up, Gary, maybe if you could share the PDF to your slides. I think it was only that last diagram that really got cut off and we couldn't fully read. And Bob, we're seeing your slides, but we're not hearing any audio yet.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Thanks. Oh gee, something's covering up things. Let me just clear so I can see myself. Um, I'm going to talk about trust in the network, applying trust to research data stakeholder roles, and just for full disclosure, I am one of the co-authors of the Trust Principles for Digital Repositories that were published a few years ago. And as Gary had said, transparency, responsibility, user focus, sustainability, and technology. And these are the short descriptions for each one. And I was glad that Gary shared the longer descriptions for each one because I had tried to fit them all on one slide and couldn't. Well, without making the print so small, no one would see it. But yeah, these are just the brief descriptions. Being transparent about your services and the holdings. So, what you do and what you have. So that's publicly accessible. And then your responsibility in terms of both your authenticity and integrity for not only your data holdings, but also your services and their persistence. And then regarding user focus, it's certainly, for the data management norms, but also for the expectations of your target user community. And so, and I think it's important to point out that your target user community's expectations can evolve over time. Uh, Certainly, in terms of your target community also changing, because as you bring in more data sets, there are more people interested in it. You might move beyond the original discipline that you were serving, for example. And also, your community might start to look at other topics and issues associated with your data and how your data can be, for example, integrated with other data sets. And so, and then also I should mention, technology changes too. And so that affects our expectations. What we expected from a data center just 10 years ago is not what we expect today. We expect a lot more. And then in terms of sustainability, it's making sure that those services can be continuously used over time by the users. And uh, certainly for the long term, and people ask often, what does long term mean? I know for a while what we were saying is long term was 50 years from when you're reading our policy, and so it was an extending term, and that the 50 years can be from today or tomorrow, for that matter. And then finally, technology, which is associated with the infrastructure and the capabilities that you provide to your users to facilitate this, the services, the security of them, and their persistence. So I have some questions here that we might want to think about. And the premise is that trust is earned. That is, you don't just have trust automatically. Uh, People trust something after uh, they've experienced something that makes them trust it. And so we can ask, can the data within a network be trusted? But we can also ask, can the network be trusted? And they're quite different here, and that you might, for instance, trust the data in one node. But does that mean you're trusting the data in all nodes? And then finally, yes, if all the nodes are trustworthy, does that really make the network trusted? Because that is a larger entity in itself. So these are all questions to consider when we think about trust and the network. And then also, if we're going to say, well, I want some evidence of trust for me to actually trust something, how are we going to measure that? And there are some uh, 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 requirements out there, for instance, for trustworthy data repositories. For instance, Core Trust Seal is one that many of us are probably familiar with. But there are others as well, and that's measuring what we would consider a trustworthy repository, and trust may be associated with that in many ways. But again, that's a moving target, and the Core Trust Seal is addressing that by trying to revise their requirements every few years, which is a great thing. And so, looking at it, we have to ask, is it within the network or across the network? Again, if we're going to measure it, and Core Trust Seal would measure one node, but not necessarily all across the network. And then finally, do the protocols of the network and the network facilitate transparency, responsibility, user focus, sustainability, and technology. I want to move along though, thinking of the time here. So thinking about this, I thought, well, how can we think about this in a way that can be practically understood by people who want to gain these things? So what I did is I just did a mapping based on a previous mapping that I had done years ago, a few years ago, between the geo data management principles and the trust principles. And so here you can see that transparency, it's relating to a few of these. And some people, I should just give you as a caveat, some people might say that transparency and responsibility, et cetera, are associated with all of these. And we could actually say that, but I decided that it would be a little more useful or helpful for people to think about them a little more precisely. And so for transparency, I mapped that to metadata, data documentation, traceability of the data, because that's your transparency, and transparency in how you preserve the data. And that's basically looking at the details of what transparency stood for, not only the brief statement, but the details that Gary showed you. Likewise, responsibility covers a few, and again, metadata is covered and data documentation, but also traceability, quality control, preservation, and data metadata verification. Looking at the user focus, how we're going to support the users and their use of the data. Of course, it's going to be metadata, but it's also, the online access, the encoding, and the data documentation, as well as data review and the persistent and resolvable identifiers. Looking at sustainability, we could say, well, are we preserving the data? Are we verifying our data and metadata? And then are we maintaining persistent and resolvable identifiers? Technology involves a lot of these things. Of course, it's the employment of our metadata, of course, because we certainly have standards of metadata that we're going with, as well as with data encoding, but also looking at how we're documenting the data and presenting that to the users, as well as how we're verifying the metadata and the data, and providing our persistent and resolvable identifiers. So with that, I want to just thank you all for your attention.
Thank you, Bob. Our next speaker is Marshall Ma.
Thanks, Gary. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I'll continue. So I'll talk about our observation and some experience about how to develop those models for preference documentation and how to apply them to a few research projects. And also I will show the result of a few research done by other researchers, not only those in the United States, but also a few ones from Europe. We know in the United States, last year, it was the year of open science. It's highly promoted by those, I think it's about 14 or 15 federal agencies. And it's interesting, on their website, I saw it's kind of formal or kind of informal definition of open science. But also interestingly, I can see it's not only about the end products of research, but also the process. I think that's kind of relevant to the topic we're going to discuss today is about the provenance and trust. And I happen to collect some definitions about provenance and also data provenance. Because English is not my first language, so I always like to dive into a dictionary when I face like a new term or a new word. Provenance is the origin or the source about something. I think especially in the field of auctions or antique auctions, provenance is an interesting topic. So on some other dictionaries, I can even see like a second or a third definition of provenance with very close relevance to the field of antiques and auction. But then talking about provenance in computer science and also provenance with relevance to open data, I found two other definitions one from W3C, the World Wide Web Consortium, and another one from NIH. So you can see it's about, we face an end product and people often talk about data as an example or anything else. And then the provenance is to document like the entities, activities, people, business, all the entities in the workflow generating that end product. And the definition for data provenance provided by NIH, I think is more or less the same information. We need to talk about the origin of the end product. Here is the data set and also the workflow. Or in other words, is where it has moved from to where it is presently. And then talking about provenance and trust, I think trust is a feeling of safety, confidence, clarity, and satisfaction, right? And then for the trust on open data, it's not only a mental feeling, but I think it should also be built on the quality and the reliability of the data set. I think that's why provenance or provenance documentation, the technologies on it, they were used to or at least partially as a kind of approach to realize trust. On the bottom, you can see a diagram from Kurt Timmer's a long time ago, almost 10 years ago, when I was a postdoc at RPI working with Peter Fox. We had a collaboration with Kurt Timmer's. And that time he was leading the like a data portal we call it a Global Change Information System for the third round of the National Climate Assessment within the USGSAPI, United States Global Change Research Program. And in his regard, provenance documentation is like a process from transparency to reproducibility. As you can see here, a number of steps as envisioned by Kurt, traceable sources, data, processes, and the tools. And again, in his discussion, he mentioned we should document the producing organizations and also the credentials of the authors, researchers in the research product generation process, and also not only in the development, but also the review process of the scientific discoveries, and also any like referenced scientific research, including publications and also software packages, algorithms used in the process. And it's very interesting. I also happened to see this short article. It's published in 2020. It's also from the group of National Climate Assessment. So it's also part of USGSAPI. But those two authors, I think at that time, 2020, they were talking about the fourth round of National Climate Assessments. And then it's very interesting to see they use exactly the word trust. When they talk about like the provenance documentation models deployed on the Global Change Information System, and also how the provenance can realize like to show people the authentic information from the National Climate Assessment. So in that way, researchers, other researchers, and also the decision makers, and also the general public, anyone interested in this program, they can kind of get a feeling, at least a feeling of trust. And also when they dive into the detailed records on the global change information system, they can actually see like all the information from the very origin of the raw data set, and also the instrument collecting the data set, software packages used to analyze the data set, to the final scientific discovery. That's a way to realize trust. I think that's why they use exactly the word trust to describe the output of the first round of national climate assessment. I think this diagram, I borrowed it from the Nature magazine, is a very good depiction about the meaning of preference. On the very top, we can see it can be either a piece of data set or publication or scientific discovery. But then we need to get a way to categorize, basically building ontologies, knowledge graphs, to describe entities, including the attributes, annotations, and then we have a way to set up identifiers and also interconnections between all those resources. And then finally, we need a way to present, if necessary, or in any other ways, if possible, we can provide those intercollected information behind the data set or behind the scientific findings. And once this is set up on the data portal, like here on the Global Change Information System, there are functionalities to let researchers to do either the data mining, or sometimes I just call it, because it's exactly metadata mining. For example, we can ask the portal to show all the NASA contributions to the sea level rise figures, or even as a way to find other researchers working on a similar topic. This is work on the USGCRP, but here is a smaller work, but also very interesting. Is done by a group of researchers in Spain. It's also in the field of climate change research, smaller, but more focused and more interesting. They also use the preference ontology of W3C, and then they develop packages in the R environments to document the preference information of a workflow. And then once the workflow is finished, like here, the normal workflow can generate a scientific product like an image you can see here, but then their package is able to append the documented preference as a piece of JSON file, JSON LD file script inside the image. And then on their portal, when you drag and drop the image to the portal, the preference information inside this image can be read out and even visualized as a graph. And because every node, every edge in this graph has this detailed information, you can even like click on them to see all the details of the preference. It's also interesting work. And also exactly happening in the ESIP community between Jihan Shen and myself and several other colleagues. In the past 3 years, we have been working on the GeoWafer. GeoWafer is a cloud-based workflow platform. It also has some functionalities to document the preference of models and also different sessions of model run. And in our work, we even develop a package to translate the workflow and also the preference information from GeoWafer to another language called a common workflow language. I think this is also a way to increase the interoperability and the reusability of workflow platforms. This is exactly like a work initiated from ESIP. So I talk about those concepts, definitions, some examples. Here I want to show this comparison between FAIR principles and their relevance to semantics and knowledge graph again. with the highlighted one row, as you can see here. I think a very important part of reusability of open data is to provide detailed preference to the data set and also the metadata. And for this part, absolutely, semantic technologies can help a lot. But also I want to make a note because like the preference of data set, if we really want to do that, we do need to build knowledge graphs, classes, attributes of several other entities. And if you begin to do this from scratch in the initial stage, this is a kind of tedious process. But once that is established, the result will be very impressive. I just want to make a note on that. I will end it here, and I will be happy to answer any questions and also have the discussion with many of you. Gary, I will return it to you.
Okay. I think we're going to save questions a little bit later, so then let's move to Chen Ho's talk on trust.
Sounds good.
And recommender systems.
Hello, everyone. My name is Chen Hao Li, a computer science PhD student from University of Idaho. And today my topic is a proposal to building a recommender system for open data portals, or we can say a data repository with trust ranking and social trust. So as we are all aware, the data is the center of everything right now, and machine learning, artificial intelligence, natural language processing, and many other trending topics are all relying on data. Even more that the concept of open data is often brought up by researchers. The definition of open data can be summarized to as open as possible and as close as necessary. And open data is also followed by the FAIR principle, where the F is stand for the findable. So we're gonna dive into the findable aspect. So let's first take a look at the current data discovery method. As for open data portals, how people finding the data they want, right? Here are two screenshots of Google dataset search and data.gov. We can see that people usually rely on keyword search and facet method, where a keyword is user typing the keyword and hope to find what they are looking for, and facet method is user using filters to narrow down the research or the result. So we want to make the data more findable. So we suggest using recommender system and social trust. The first is easy to understand is we want to get a recommendation of data that we may be interested in. And the second social trust is also we want to be able to trust those recommendations. So here's what a basic recommendation system will look like. This is a typical homepage of Netflix account, right? At top, you have recommendation system, recommendations based on your watch history and what's trending right now. And the third row is recommendation based on a single watch history. In this case, it's because you watch Narcos, which is a great show. And so what if we can build a system similar to this, but instead of recommending shows, we recommend data? So here's the bibliometrics analyze I have done. And this is for this literature review, I use those query open data recommender system, a trustworthy recommender systems, and on Scopus, and we are able to find 1,661 articles from 2007, 2018. And we can see the annual production of this kind of topic is definitely raising up. And here's the co-occurrence of the keyword in those articles. As we can see that recommended system has strong connection with trust is here and here. And as there are research done to how to improve the trust on recommendations and how people sometimes feel concerned about the recommendation they have received. But there are a weak connection between recommended system and open data, from recommended system to open data, because there are not many research done on this area, and most of them is on how to solve the cold start problem of the recommender system by using open data. So our approach to building a recommendation system will be divided into two parts: active searching and passive searching. The passive recommendations, I will dive into deep later. So for the active searching part, when user type in the keyword, our system will first do a similarity comparison between the keywords and our data portals. But this is not enough. We also want to rank them. Traditionally, search engine will often use click rate to rank the result, but we think it's not enough. As what if we have a brand new data portal that there has no user interaction history, and usually sometimes there's a lot of false positive when doing the similarity comparisons. So we propose a trust-based ranking system to rank the results. So our data set, after going through the similarity comparison, we will do a trust-based ranking and then finally display the result. But there are challenges with this approach. First is trust metric selection. Since I'm not expert in trust, I cannot say why certain metadata are more suitable for trust score computation than others. All I can say is that, for example, metadata about a publisher may be suitable for this kind of computation. Secondly, each metrics will have different weights in its computations, but how can we find the proper weight to each metrics? Also, how we gonna evaluate our result? So our proposed solution to solve these challenges is using machine learning. First of all, we can use feature selection methods such as filter wrapper and embedding method, and then compare the result. We first set a group of metrics that we think are suitable and let the feature selection to determine what is the best metrics. What are the best metrics? For the weight assigning, we want to rely on machine learning model that has weight learning features. For example, here are the diagram of artificial neural networks models. Each neuron has a set of features and a weight, and it goes through different layers and predict the output. The output then is then compared to the ground truth, then travel back to the beginning to adjust each weight. So using feature selection and weight learning machine learning models can solve our challenge, and the last challenge is evaluate. Since machine learning, we can easily evaluate our results, so that challenge is being solved too. So for passive recommendations, we want to implement two recommendation part. The first one is top ranking system. We extract user item interaction history. In this case, it's their search history or the select research field when user first sign up, and then recommend the popular data or articles in those fields. Second, we want to create a social trust network based on recommender system that is more personalized. So the networks we're gonna be creating are the items network, where one items can lead to its author, co-author, and research field. Those can lead to other articles. Based on the social trust, if you think this article is useful to you, maybe the article from the same author is also useful to you. For the user network is where a user may find other user in the same field, may share the same interests and taste in articles. So we can form a closed network to share new articles that is new to particular user within the circle. We hope that our recommendation system will not only increase data discoverability in the data portal, but also make it more trustworthy. So here's the immediately next step for the development and implementation. First is using machine learning method to form a trust ranking system. We will able to find a data set, which is challenging, but I have high hope we can find a suitable data set that we can train on. And also we need to think about how to construct our top ranking system, how to extract search field, and how we define our popularity. And also, we need to think about the structure of our item network and user network and have a fine definition of that. And that's it. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Shenho. So our final speaker from the panel will be Pierre, who will in part bring this back to the ODIS context, which was part of my last slide. So
all right, Gary,
Pierre.
can you see that?
Yep. I can see, we can see it fine, nice and blue.
All right, great. Just 1 second.
I note that we have lots of good comments and questions and discussion in the chat already.
Hi, sorry about that. Okay, so just to wrap it all up, we're going to take a look. I mean, ODIS has been presented in two of the sessions earlier, so we're not going to spend too much time on that. But these are some lessons learned about the things that have actually created more trust in our network as it's been organically growing over the past few years, you know, that it's now grown to member states, individual research groups, and others. Is the audio okay? Can you hear me?
Yes, your
Yeah.
audio is coming through.
Okay, great. So these are just some things that we've observed on the way. This is not a framework. This is not an acronym. It's just sort of things that we're considering about when we're formulating our UNESCO steering committee for this and others, the things that we're really watching out for. So it's just going to be some text and some talking points that we can pick up in the discussion. So firstly, you know, the overall concept, you know, trust is a verb. It's something that you do. And you know that sort of thinking is important for us when we think about implementation. We don't just sort of say that, okay, we trust X and therefore it's done. You need to trust, but continually, as they say, verify, right? And I think that's key for digital systems in particular, because we can do that. We can develop technology to monitor trusted networks. So this is a sort of recipe for how our digital ecosystem, one of the goals of ODIS is to bring people progressively closer together, starting at the metadata level and going deeper until they get to know each other, until they know that their systems can trust one another, that the data is indeed interoperable. It's not just a question of filling out a checklist or signing a document, and that they can actually work together, you know, the core of interoperability. First thing that we realize, of course, you know, concepts matter, semantics matter. If you're not talking about the same thing, you're not going to get very far in terms of trust. And this is, we're particularly vulnerable to this because of things like fair or care. Everyone is saying it, but in terms, when you look at the low-level implementations, they can be very different. So again, digging into the semantics is really important. And also we have to balance this against what funders want to hear, what policymakers, high-level managers, etc. They want to hear those words. And people are then feel compelled to say it, but then it starts to poison the semantics. You start to say a data space has started to mean something very different in Europe because of the plan to establish a European data space. This has ended up actually weakening the technical definition of data space to the benefit of no one, really. So we have to be very careful when we use words like those listed here. What are we actually talking about? And are we diverging from something? Second thing that helped a lot is there are 12 of these, so we're going to get through this. Second thing is just defining the shared vision and mission of the system. It doesn't actually help to work in a different direction. You have to figure out where people are willing to trust each other and how far that trust is going to go. If you scope that out at the early stages, people won't be disappointed or overextend. And that's really key, to be clear about the roles. What are people willing to do? What parts of the challenge are they taking up? And is it within their capacity? If you aim right, it's going to matter. So again, things like implementation plans, strategy documents that I talked about in the earlier talks, all of those are key because those are the things that you can cross-check the lower level implementations with. And if your high-level strategy and mid to low-level implementation all line up, then you're in business. Then trust is much more likely to thrive. Third step is to actually map the alliance. It doesn't really help.
Pierre, Luigi, we lost your audio. It looks like you're muted.
Hi, what happened? You couldn't hear me.
Yeah, we lost your audio for a moment, but it sounds like
Yeah.
you're back.
All right, great. Sorry, I'm not sure what happened. So then mapping the alliance is another part. We showed this in our earlier talks, through Doug's technology and our knowledge graph. You have to know what's going on. You have to know who's in your alliance and what they're doing, so that people are happy with the way that they're presented. That, all right, our capacities, our data nodes, and our agreed contributions to something are well defined and the way we like them to be. So this is really key that they are in charge of their own linked data entity that describes their organization, project, people, etc. So that means it's not just a question of doing a survey that ends up in a document. We need to digitize those maps so we can build things like that, where people's identities are under their control. So for those of you who know about Tim Berners-Lee's SOLID framework, the closer we get to that, the better off we're going to be, because then you're going to have that bubble of information that's managed by the people who are responsible for it. The more we can take back the web to the actual user, the better it's going to be. Then, of course, there's the administrative part of it. You need the right kind of ingredients for your steering and operational teams that guide the projects and guide the collaborations. One of the major obstacles is often that the high-level direction of something is the last time they touched code could be a decade ago or more. That can't be when we're doing this, because that's another thing that decouples the low-level implementation of things like our semantic networks, like our knowledge graphs, from the actual high-level priorities of organizations, funders, etc. This is hurting us. This is hurting us right now. And so balanced steering committees who are not just the high-level managers, but also include the technical folks is key. In ODIS, we've always mixed this up. We've kind of had this as the SAS, say a Chinese parliament where rank doesn't matter before we actually operate. And that's quite key. Another thing that's been very helpful, to build trust, you have to start at the basics, right? So you build a foundation first and then get into the high level stuff. So the metadata graphs that came from schema.org, the broadly accepted stuff that's already pretty well established, let's see how well we do with that before we go to more complex goals. So that's the key, and also tightly coupling that whatever we're doing at the front end is very well structured on the back end. That's really key, because often you'll see a very fancy portal with beautiful maps and everything, but the back end technology is not well deployed, and so it's very brittle. So we have to be really carefully balancing those two things. That has a technological aspect, of course, but it also has a sort of a digital culture aspect too. So we have to be sure that the backends are used by multiple portals to make sure that it can be trusted to run downstream applications. So we have to put the upstream where it needs to be and downstream where it needs to be. That's something that Terry McConnell said in one of our G7 meetings for digitally twinning the ocean last, 2 years ago now, that you have to do the plumbing before you start building sparkly fountains. And in ODIS, that's been a central concept. So anything that we're building on the front end is run by the data exchange. The data and the visualization are extremely close together, such that we don't need to write any kind of modifiers that restructure the data in order to have it in the front end, maybe with a couple of exceptions, but we try to minimize those as much as we can. We've sort of said that easy. The minimal functions, the minimal viable product, it's key. And then progressively build out. That's, again, just a sensible thing to do. We do that with human relationships. We should do that with digital systems too. That's another key. The continuous integration stuff that we all use in GitHub or so to just make sure things are working and we haven't broken our code, that works on the trust built between digital systems too. Think of it like continuous integration, to know that the things that are said to be shared and validated and interoperable are indeed shared, findable, interoperable. That has a continuous diagnostic aspect. In ODIS, as I mentioned before, we have a dashboard that checks our partnership, that checks each contributing member. And if something goes wrong, like that little X represents, we can contact the partner and say, hey, look, we've noticed something is up. That gives them the opportunity to fix it, to grow the graph, and for us to, again, concretely monitor things. That's the verify part of the trust and verify. Then, of course, we have this long vision that UNESCO has. We have this great vision about ocean data sharing at the end of the decade, so 2030, when the SDGs also come to their conclusion. But we have to make sure that that long view is not just a promise that short-term gains are also possible. So again, that's the economics of the system that people need to be on board. So even though now ODIS has been accepted as a sub-program of IODE, so it's not every day that a project changes the inner workings of a UN program. So that's given the long view. People know that it's worth investing in it. We didn't start that way, but we started with people saying, okay, the web does work like this. The tech teams seem to be happy and the high-level management are getting what they want. Great, so that we can align it to these larger strategies. So all of those ingredients come together for that long view to be more tangible. Once you have that and you have the conceptual buy-in, you have to make sure the governance is balanced. And to have balanced governance, you need distributed ownership. Everybody needs a stake in that to say, all right, this is worth it. It's actually working for us. And we're also willing to sort of co-fund it and co-govern it. Nobody's interested in co-funding or investing resources, be that time or be that financial resources, into something that they don't have some kind of control over. And that's quite important. So we have our steering group, we have our committees that will help this happen. And also we made sure that the initial implementation was in regions that really need the data system to work for their local decision making and that they shouldn't be left behind. So those pilot projects, I mentioned this earlier in the overview, but they have local hubs like the Pacific Data Hub that actually produces a huge amount of value in that region. And their interaction with ODIS is actually helping them augment some of the functions in that hub. The same is true with our Africa region. Through ODIS, we've been able to reinvigorate the ODIN Africa network to create a more federated data sharing solution for that continent and that region more broadly. And that's exactly what we need, because then they can guide ODIS from their regional point of view and make sure that their interests are being met. The same is true in Latin America. There's a portal there too. Once you have that, once you've had that core and have that co-governance, you have to take care of it. So when partnerships are being built, you have a different way of looking at those partnerships. It's not just a question of getting more logos on a page or something of that kind. It's making sure that people are actually willing to contribute to the same multilateral model. Multilateralism means that it's delayed reciprocity, some sort of mechanism for conflict resolution. Have you chosen the right multilateral model to move this onward? And is that something everyone can buy into without feeling alienated? So once you know that, you can implement that more precisely. Part of that is to make sure that it's not brittle. And part of that is to make sure that innovation, like the next best thing, does not destabilize the operations of the network. Of course, we love innovation. We want it to happen. But that has to be in its own box that gradually feeds in to the operational network, because people need stability in order for trust to grow. Think of the satellite programs, for example. These are 10-year missions to build a satellite and launch it. You can't keep switching out components. Data systems, especially more complex ones, are operating like that. So you need to balance a bit of conservatism with that sort of innovation way of thinking. Once you're there, the last step is a kind of iterative step. Once you do that, you kind of rinse and repeat so you can go deeper and deeper into interoperability. The generic metadata layer that started with Science on Schema and that we've adapted into ODIS has created the foundation which we can now deepen to other data types that are a pressing need for the ocean community and beyond also. And then we can help this to plan, and again, in an operational mode. So we know that as we go deeper, things are happening. An example with the biomolecular observing network, so eDNA, omics, metabolites. So they're using that ODIS shell to start to nest in some of their links to known data systems like the Ocean Biodiversity Information System, the INSDC for sequence information, and many more regional partners. Again, that shell provides them with a basis in which to bring those resources together and build trust internally. Okay, with that, I'll end. I know it's probably a bit longer, but some thoughts for you that we're thinking about in OIH and in ODIS more broadly as we take this into the sub-program phase of our IODE work.
Well, thank you, Pierre. That was wonderfully rich. Not only metadata is the only thing that's rich here. We have a lot of things we could possibly discuss. I'll kick things off for panel discussion, and we could go from there. One observation I have is that we're building more complex ecosystem-like systems to help us with some of the complexity here. They change over time. There's a question of integration and understanding how they're working. And so one of the early questions that Bob raised, how are these measured? How are they earned? And I think Pierre he went to quite a degree of answering some of those questions. So I'm wondering if Bob would agree, and other people, Marshall and Chen Ho, would agree that what Pierre laid out are important steps as examples of complex systems that are understandable and going away to earning trust, including by cross validations and a variety of things that Pierre talked about. So what do the other panelists have to say about that?
Yeah, I think that's very important that Pierre brought those up, and I think we need to continue work in that direction so that we can begin to determine, whether in fact trust has been earned, and we can verify it and continue to verify it on an ongoing basis.
I mean, I think that's also like the basis where we can sort of diversify or at least extend the logic of things like Core Trust Seal and others to people who, again, who have never heard of it. This came up in the chat too. If systems like ODIS have, as part of their dashboard checks, sort of continuous integration checks, elements that align roughly to that framework, then in a sense, we've sort of pre-loaded the system to say, all right, you're close with this.
Other comments?
And we had a lot of talks in the chat. I mean, if anyone wants to take the floor, please do so, raise things. With the recommender systems, I'm always I'm really in awe of people who try to take on that challenge, because it's so hard to make it work and for it's something to be neutral and aware of anything. But then I think in ODIS, we actually, like, if all of the nodes in ODIS are happy with the way that they're being represented, then that actually allows a recommendation system to confidently approach it, because they are aware that they're putting on the material that they want in there. So I don't know if Chen Hao has thoughts on that. Like, what would be an ideal scenario for you to apply your recommender system?
Well, ideal. So first of all, the data should have be like authorized, I guess. So, and also should be well formatted. There's a lot of rich like metadata of the data set, right? And there should be a user network, so we can know. From my approach is that we want to know who your colleague is, who you're working with, stuff like that. So that's my sort of ideal. And also there should be like if you are if somebody log into your website, right, and they're satisfied with your data set, they can give you like a thumbs up or something like that. That would be tremendously helpful to building recommended systems.
That's interesting.
We often hear about data being authoritative, which the question is how does it become authoritative? And I guess part of that is through community adoption and recommendations itself. So not only individuals giving thumbs up, but entire communities doing that. I also like the aspect of Pierre's talk, for example, as an incrementally deepening approach. And so with continual evaluation, essentially the next level deeper, essentially has quality added to it because you've evaluated how you are on a relatively simple approach, maybe with a small number of people. We used to often talk about things like prototypes to demonstrate the value of something. So this is sort of like a perpetual iterative prototypes that are better and better over time. Anybody else on that? I have one other question, then we can turn it over to the general audience and all the things we see in chat. Bob talked a little bit about the network, and I was a little bit confused between the communication aspect of a network and people and project sense of a network. Maybe he meant all of those. And Pierre, of course, mentioned something about the network that ODIS is part of, or it consists of. So maybe, Bob, if you could clarify a little bit to me when you talk about network problems, what you were referring to, and particularly in light of what Pierre might have said.
Yeah, well, certainly the network is all the parts of the individual nodes. And if we're talking about, data centers and the data and services that they provide. We can't necessarily say that the entire network is trustworthy just because a node is trustworthy or the data within one node is trustworthy. I think, though, if we could look at all of the nodes in a data center, a data network, and say that, yes, all those data centers are trustworthy and all their data are trustworthy, the services, et cetera, then I think we can approach a network being trustworthy. But the network really is different than each of the nodes. It's more than all the nodes because there might be a whole different level of governance over the network that is independent of the nodes, other than the fact that the nodes are part of the network. So it is separate from the network at the same time. And, that is a separate, the network is separate from all the nodes, but at the same time, it encompasses all the nodes. I don't know if that's helpful in terms of trust, but yeah, I think that it would be valuable if we're going to try to verify trust within a network, that all of the nodes in the network are verified as trustworthy. And then if the network has a way to go beyond that to enable us to verify its trustworthiness, then it certainly should take those kinds of measures.
And it connects a bit to that point on scoping, right? So for example, the trust function that people would give to ODIS as a network is that it's functioning, that people can share their information, and that it's providing documentation that allows people to do that, and that its validation functions are working. That's all it does. It does not it's just like the internet in a sense, right? The internet doesn't guarantee you'll find the information you were looking for, but it's up. It's up and it has some sort of uptime. So scoping that is important because people need to trust in the things that have been committed to be done. When it comes to whether or not people trust the actual data moving through that network, that's a two-way street, right? So one of the things that we're interested in doing is helping people declare their criteria for trusting data and using that to scan the network for stuff that might be interesting to them. So everyone has their own needs. The need of a citizen science project is very different from, let's say, a federally funded environmental assessment. And those have different trust functions. And that's something we're really bad at as a community right now, digitizing the trust function. It's kind of difficult. As soon as we do that, we'll have a better basis for matchmaking people's requirements and criteria to the offerings in an open network like the internet or like ODIS or others.
I would add a little bit, thinking of this in terms of node connections, that you might trust each node, but you might be a question about the interoperability of the data between them. And if you create a query that essentially uses data from each, the question is whether you can trace, as Marshall was talking about traceability, trace the fact that gives you reliable answers because they are each having a same meaning in terms of the data they're using as part of the integration. I see we have about 20 minutes left, and so I'm wondering maybe we should turn this back to Joseph for a more general Q&A, and maybe let people who have put questions in the chat have an opportunity to ask those. So with that, let me turn it back to Joseph, and we can proceed in a more general fashion here.
Thanks, Gary. Yeah, does anyone have any questions that haven't been asked in the chat that they'd like to ask to the panel, or just broadly for anyone to put in? If not, we can go over some of the questions in the chat. Certainly during some of the presentations, there was quite a bit flying back and forth in the chat while the presentations were happening live.
Yeah, one thing I'd like to pick up there, it's that idea, again, what happens when a system is retired, right, or goes away? part of that is knowing that they have this obsolescence strategy, right? It's been too much that people create a portal that becomes extremely important and people rely on that. And when funding runs out or strategy changes, it disappears, right? Without any kind of strategy about how they're going to hand over their data or their assets. That's becoming more complicated as you have more data sovereignty laws and regulations coming up about can they actually do that? So that's something I think it's quite important to talk about. I don't know how many systems actually do that. ODIS, this was raised by a number of our members, and we will archive our content in Zenodo periodically, so that even if the IODE stops supporting it, that's not the plan, but even if it does, there's that trace. And also the nodes themselves self-sustain the network, right? So even if IODE doesn't sponsor it anymore, if it's useful to the nodes participating, it continues. So again, engineering different kinds of cost-benefit functions can help people trust in longevity for sure. Everyone's quiet now, gotta say. But yeah, it's an open floor. So
And I have an additional comment.
Like
I saw the core trusted cell was mentioned in the chat. That's really good because it's really interesting. When I graduated from University of Twente, that was in Netherlands, I actually met some people from DINS and also in that time it's called the 3UT data center. I think that's the first time I heard about this core trusted cell. That was how long time ago? Almost 13 or 14 years ago. But coming back to the discussing by some people, so open data absolutely it's like an ecosystem. It's social technical. It's absolutely not like a pure technical, not only like semantics or preference documentation. It also relies on a lot of efforts by the data providers, data managers, and also the data portal development, and also the interactions with the users. And I can see this at several levels. I think as Gary mentioned, on the community level, absolutely for some data portals, we do need to have some kind of standards or metrics to evaluate the quality of a data portal. I mean, on a very high level, I think that's how the core trusted cell can be implemented. And also on the individual data set level, we can see, for example, we can trace the number of usage, the number of downloads, and also sometimes the number of citations received by the data set. And also we can count not only an individual data set, but also like a data portal overall. And then another work I think mentioned by Bob Downs is like a network. We can think about a data set not only as an individual node, but also put it in a network. I think this means a lot of things. We can think about the network of data sets, and we can also think about the network of provenance. So link between data sets to the provenance information, algorithms, original data sets, and then instruments or sensors collecting data set, and also the organizations hosting the data set. In that way, we can extend our source to a lot of other interesting stuff, like we can see the algorithms of recommendations. We can also see association analysis, like what we can see on Amazon, on Google. So that's just some source for discussing. It's absolutely like a socio-technical system. It's not a pure technical.
Yeah, but just like that, it's open to the same vulnerabilities that societies are open to, right? Yeah. So we see this with what happens in our social media networks, or how advertising on the web has affected where attention goes. It's so easy for trust to be hijacked by popularity. And people have full-time jobs like search engine optimization, trying to increase popularity of things, regardless of whether or not they're the right thing for somebody at the right time. So again, trying to correct that within the IODE system, we're trying to figure out how to do this. But since we have known nodes with known interests, and they can put out calls there, even if a data set is not very popular or doesn't come from the right journal or the right data system, if it was just published on the web by some small team working at the right time at the right place, that's equity. That's digital equity, and solving this sort of ethical question. How can we change our implementations of our systems to pick that up? And that means, yeah, we heard it in the chat, word of mouth, for example, right? That's important when somebody says, look, this really solved my problem. That might be a quiet voice, but how do we amplify that in systems like recommender systems or in digital networks?
Bob has his hand up.
Yeah, so thanks. Uh, since Cortro Seal was brought up again, and it was made clear that everybody isn't aware of Cortro Seal, I just wanted to give a little bit of background. And the Cortro Seal that came out of the World Data System. They had a certification process for trustworthiness of digital repositories and the Data Seal of Approval, and they had a separate certification set of requirements. And so realizing that these were competing with each other and that if they worked together, they could actually improve the process and the requirements. They were combined as a result, a combined effort in the RDA, the Research Data Alliance. That's an international organization, for those who aren't aware of it. It came out of the RDA effort to create that, and then the Cortro Seal actually became a nonprofit organization in the Netherlands. And so there is a board, a Cortro Seal Standards and Certification Board, as well as an assembly of reviewers. For clarity, I should say that I was one of the founding members of the Cortro Seal Board, and I continue to be a member of the Assembly of Reviewers. But the Assembly of Reviewers are the ones who are actually reviewing Cortro Seal applications and recommending or any improvements that might be necessary in order to get certified. And then the board would actually certify that, and then the certified repository would be eligible to become a member of the World Data System.
But Bob, doesn't CTS need to scale up to the more complex ecosystem-like situations we now have?
Well, yeah, it recently did. It was about 3 years ago, I guess, right at the beginning of COVID. The institutional repositories and the general repositories expressed interest in getting certified as well. And so what the Cortro Seal Board did, and I was on the board at that time, is we worked with the community to identify how the more general repositories, generalist repositories, like some of these commercial ones, and the institutional repositories that are in many universities, how they might get certified as well. And so the process was enhanced to include generalist repositories and institutional repositories so that they could get certified as well. There are mixed feelings about the results of this process, and I think that as the Cortro Seal requirements are revised every 3 years, they were just revised, I think it was last year. Well, actually, we're 2024 now, so it was 2 years ago. They were revised, but they went into effect at the beginning of last year. And so I think that in a couple more years, when the Cortro Seal requirements are revised again, they will be taking these kinds of concerns into account. And certainly, I would recommend that any members of the community, especially those who have become certified, should be weighing in on this. And to that effect, I should also mention that the Cortro Seal Board is always looking for additional certified repositories to volunteer the staff members to become part of the Assembly of Reviewers, because there's a lot of demand for these repositories to be reviewed and not enough reviewers. So this would be a good opportunity for those who've gone through the process to give back. It's just like reviewing papers in a way. Probably a little more work than reviewing a scholarly publication, because you kind of have to look at all the evidence and for each of the requirements. But it's actually very informative, and you can learn a lot by doing that.
So Pierre had a question to Renya on it. I thought that was relevant. Maybe Renya could take a look at that in the chat, or Pierre could.
Yeah, I'm working on a response right now, but I can maybe just speak to it, even though my voice is getting lost. I
Yes.
assume you're talking about the one about automating the order seal criteria. So one avenue that I've been thinking about and talking about with some others is, so recently or in progress is the RDA data repository attributes working group outputs, which have outlined 17 attributes, and these are getting mapped to both re3 data and schema.org. I believe even the SOSO group has in their GitHub an action item regarding this. But basically, we're looking to, as the World Data System, be an adopter of what's happening in that working group and trying to get the repositories to make their records more comprehensive in this regard. And then potentially one could utilize that with mappings to the core trust seal requirements and begin to pull some content out automatically or do summary or analysis on that. So there's some potential there. I think there's other ideas floating around, but that's sort of one that I've been kind of starting to look at.
Yeah, I mean, I asked this because in systems like ODIS, we could never give a recommendation sort of saying, hey, everyone get core trust seal certified, because of our global networks and the diversity of implementations don't always map that way. But at the same time, a lot of the advice is very sensible. I mean, Emmanuel says in the chat also, there are other frameworks, but it's just a question of people power, still human review of things. Of course, it's still necessary, but can we abstract some of those to become automated checks so we can shortlist things that could then go in for deeper human-based review for full certification? If things like Core Trust Seal and other certification networks gave us a set of, let's say, some kind of tooling or some sort of implementable criteria that we could scan our network and say, hey, does your system meet these? We can pre-stage a lot of this, and I think that'll be more useful at scale, also supporting regions and coming up with their own certifications schemes that map their actual priorities as opposed to a generic one.
Yeah, and I was thinking like I would call them maybe more indicators rather than compliance with the principles, but like potentially, let's say if the schema.org representation could hold all these attributes and you had these mapped to the trust principles or the core trust seal requirements, you could have some way of, summarizing that in the display of a repository or where a data set's coming from, something like that.
Yeah. And I think, like when you think about long-term funding, for example, if we do what banks or other contract-based systems can do, send a token to a funder to verify that funding is in place, and you can automatically confirm that, then you don't need a human to do the sort of the busy work of checking, writing letters, etc. Because this is normal in financial markets when data exchanges with financial transactions, tokenized hashes, etc. Why can't we do it here? To validate things like that. It's all possible. It's just a question of getting it on the roadmap, even if we can't do it now, saying that it is possible and desirable.
So I was wondering if I could just pipe in a little bit here, because I think you raised an important point about the developing countries, the repositories in the developing countries, not necessarily having the resources to go through these certifications and to actually apply, pay the certification, the application fee, et cetera. And these are very valid concerns. In fact, I used to be previously involved in the ISO 16363 certification efforts. And there, that was my largest complaint is repositories on soft money couldn't afford these things. And so I was so glad to see that the Core Trust Seal came about. So that certainly is a lot less costly, we should say, not only in terms of the application fee, but in terms of being able to meet the requirements, because that's really the larger cost and going through the efforts to develop all of your policies, putting into place ways of implementing those so that you're continually doing what you say you're doing, etc. And that does take a lot of staff resources that not only is challenging for repositories that are on soft money, but it's even more challenging for the data repositories that are in these developing countries. As part of a severe effort, what we're doing is we're working with these repositories in West African countries to help them to bring their capabilities up to the point where they can apply for Core Trust Seal certification. And then in that regard, I should mention that the Core Trust Seal also has an opportunity where those who are applying from developing countries can apply for cost reductions in that regard. And also, there's an opportunity the Core Trust Seal offers where repositories that are part of a network, like what we've been talking about today, can go in together as a consortium, and then they're getting a reduced application fee in that regard as well. But yeah, I completely agree that the cost of these things, not only getting certification, but actually doing the work to get the capabilities in place to be certified it's really monumental. It's not a simple effort.
I think we could talk another hour about this, but we're close to our limits here. And hopefully some of this for interested parties will continue in the third and final session tomorrow. And so let me turn it back to Joe, who might give us a brief view of that.
Yes. Thank you, Gary. Thank you all for all the questions and comments. Tomorrow we have our third and final session called a working session to further a trustworthy data network for marine data in the ocean decade. I believe we have three short talks, three short presentations tomorrow, followed by a panel discussion on, I believe, extending ODIS with deep ocean data. And then after that, we'll turn it out into a longer 30-minute-ish open discussion, trying to talk about anything and everything that's happened so far in these sessions, talk about the potential of integrating maybe your data set or knowledge, integrating your data into something like ODIS, whether that be at a technical level or a higher level. And yeah, thank you everybody for coming here. We hope to see you tomorrow. Thank you all.
Everybody, hope to see you tomorrow.
Ciao, ciao.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye now.